8 winters after the orc left the harbor. Some wounds never bleed. They simply refuse to close, feeding on silence until every breath carries the echo of the moment she walked away. I stepped onto Greyhaven's eastern quay after 8 brutal winters on the frozen frontier, the same biting salt wind clawing at my face as it had the day she vanished from my future. Back then I was 24, armed only with a battered blade, a frayed uniform, and a reckless vow that I would someday return worthy of the orc woman who owned my heart. Her name was Elira Voss. Her amber eyes held a silent power that convinced a penniless soldier he could conquer empires just to earn one more look from her, even if outsiders mistook her quiet grace for weakness. She never stopped loving me. That certainty lived deep in my bones. What shattered us was far simpler and far more vicious. She allowed her family to speak for her heart. Their dread became her farewell on that icy quay, while I stood rooted watching the only life I craved sail out with the tide. The city welcomed me like an old rival wearing a polite mask. Slick moss still coated the stone stairs. Sharp roofs still pierced the sea gusts. The heavy blend of brine, smoked fish coal haze, and ancient tide filled the air exactly as before. I had become someone else entirely. They now addressed me as Captain Kieran Ashvale, the officer who came back from the ice border, bearing 3 decisive victories, 2 medals on my chest, and wealth substantial enough to make merchants and lesser nobles lower their heads. My name unlocked doors once barred against me. Yet those respectful glances only fueled my resentment. They saw the finished surface. None witnessed the hidden toll etched into every scar and sleepless hour that purchased it. The instant I entered the Port Authority Hall, a thin drizzle stung down from heavy clouds. My cloak hung damp and weighted. My boots traced dark trails over the polished stone. Council members, traders of both human and orc lineages, old noble houses and ambitious newcomers had assembled to debate the ambitious new harbor that would reshape the entire northern coast. I strode in, flanked by naval officers. Then my gaze locked on her. Elira stood beside the tall eastern window, grey silk gloves sheathing her hands, a deep moss-green gown tracing the powerful yet elegant height only orc women possess. Black hair swept low at her nape, fastened by a single silver clasp shaped like a breaking wave. Time had honed the girl into a woman of striking composure, yet the sight of her still stole the air from my lungs as though no seasons had passed. She noticed me in the same heartbeat. The distance between us tightened like a drawn bowstring, heavier than any gale I had endured. She did not surge forward. She did not weep or falter. She simply remained perfectly still for one breath too long, as if the absent years had collided into her chest without mercy. Then she offered the precise, courteous dip of her head, demanded by protocol. Captain Ashvale. I answered with the slightest nod. Lady Elira. 2 words, nothing else. Yet the formal title I selected instead of her given name raised the final barrier between us and the tempest already stirring in my veins. The session opened. Voices detailed new shipping channels, extended piers, warehouses, salt vaults, and revised taxes. I absorbed none of it. From the edge of my vision, she sat scarcely 10 paces away, and I loathed how my body still catalogued every subtle motion she made under strain, how her thumb traced the glove seam, how her fingers settled on the table to anchor herself. Toward the conclusion, a council elder referenced the Voss family's required signature for the Eastern land grant. Elira stood. Her voice had gained depth, still soft yet firmer than the hesitant tone of the 19-year-old who once confronted me on the stone quay. The Voss house will scrutinize every clause concerning coal routes and orc mooring rights, she declared. If this harbor grants advantage to one side merely on parchment, it becomes coercion disguised in refined language. Murmurs of unease spread through the chamber. I kept my stare fixed on her. She never glanced my direction, but every deliberate sentence felt aimed directly at me. When the meeting finally closed, I intended to depart at once. A soldier learns early never to linger where resolve can crack. Yet as my boot touched the outer steps, fabric whispered behind me and her voice sliced through the drizzle. Kieran. 8 winters of separation, and that single syllable stripped every triumph I had earned of all value. I turned. She waited beneath the portico, rain glazing her shoulders in silver. Her eyes contained pain compressed so tightly it had grown nearly invisible. I offer my sincere wishes for your safe return, she said. I studied her longer than wisdom advised. Thank you. I should have kept walking. Instead, she spoke once more, so softly the wind nearly stole the sound. You appear changed. A short, joyless sound escaped me. Any man who survives 8 winters on the ice border will. Her face lost color for the briefest moment. In that instant I realized I still held the power to wound her, and that forgiveness remained far beyond my grasp. I stepped into the rain and left her sheltered. I did not glance back. yet the entire path to the docks thrummed with the fierce rhythm of my own pulse, identical to the afternoon she had watched my ship vanish beyond the horizon. That night, for the first time in 8 winters, sleep refused to claim me. The room I had rented near the old naval barracks felt too small, the bed too hard, the darkness too full of her. I lay awake listening to the distant crash of waves against the quay, each surge reminding me of the exact pitch of her voice when she had spoken my name after all those years. The title lady I had thrown at her like a shield now felt hollow. She had grown into the role her family once forced upon her, yet the woman beneath the poise remained the same Elira who had once traced idle patterns on my palm during stolen moments by the harbor wall. I rose before dawn, dressed in the crisp uniform that still felt foreign on my shoulders, and walked the length of the eastern docks. Greyhaven stirred slowly. Fishermen hauled nets heavy with silver, catch merchants unrolled canvas awnings, and the first orc traders from the inland clans led pack mules laden with woven wool and cured hides. Their presence here had once been rare. Now it was commonplace, a fragile sign that the old wars had truly ended. Yet the tension in the air never fully dissolved. Every negotiation, every shared pier carried the memory of blood once spilled between our kinds. I stopped at the very spot where we had parted 8 winters earlier. The wooden planks had been replaced twice since then, yet the location felt unchanged. I could still see her standing there, tall and straight, the wind whipping strands of black hair across her face as she delivered the words her family had rehearsed for her. I cannot bind my life to a man who has only promises and a soldier's wage. Her voice had trembled on the last syllable, but she had not looked away. I had wanted to argue, to beg, to promise the moon and the tide itself. Instead, I had simply nodded, turned and boarded the ship without another glance. Pride had sealed my mouth that day. Pride and the crushing certainty that I was not yet enough. Now I was more than enough by every measure the world valued. Coin filled my purse, medals weighed my coat, men twice my age sought my counsel on trade routes and border defenses. Yet standing on that same dock, I felt the same hollow ache I had carried across 8 frozen campaigns. Wealth could not fill the space she had left. Titles could not silence the question that had haunted every quiet moment on the frontier. What if I had fought harder for her then? The drizzle had eased into a fine mist by the time I returned to the Port Authority for the second day of meetings. I arrived early, hoping to claim a seat far from the Voss delegation. Fate, however, had other plans. The only available chair at the long oak table placed me directly across from her. Elira entered moments later, accompanied by her aunt Lady Talia, whose sharp gaze swept the room like a hawk searching for weakness. Elira's expression remained serene, but I caught the briefest flicker in her amber eyes when they met mine, something raw and unguarded that vanished before anyone else could notice. The discussions dragged through the morning. Maps were unrolled, arguments rose and fell over mooring fees and orc caravan rights. I spoke when required, my voice steady, my mind elsewhere. Every time Elira addressed the table, her words carried the same measured authority I had heard the day before, yet now I heard the undercurrent of exhaustion beneath them. She fought not only for her house, but for a future where orcs were not merely tolerated, but truly equal in the new harbor's prosperity. I admired the steel in her, even as it reminded me how much she had been forced to harden since the girl I once knew. During a brief recess, while others stepped outside for air, I remained seated. Elira did the same. The hall emptied until only the two of us and the low crackle of the hearth remained. She folded her gloved hands on the table and spoke without looking up. "You have every reason to hate me." I leaned back, studying the way the firelight played across the silver clasp in her hair. "Hate requires energy I no longer possess." She lifted her gaze then, and the honesty in it nearly undid me. "Then what do you feel when you look at me, Kieran?" The question hung between us, heavier than any council debate. I considered lying, I considered walking out. Instead, I gave her the truth I had carried across 8 winters. "I feel the same man who once stood on that dock and watched you choose safety over us. Only now I know the cost of that choice for both of us." Her fingers tightened until the grey silk strained. For the first time since my return, the perfect composure cracked. She opened her mouth to reply, but the door swung open and the others filed back in. The moment shattered. We returned to our roles, Captain Ashvale and Lady Elira, while the meeting resumed as though nothing had passed between us. Yet something had. The air between our seats felt charged, alive with 8 years of unsaid words. I knew then that the new harbor was not the only project reshaping Greyhaven. Whatever remained of us, broken, scarred, unfinished, was also being rebuilt plank by painful plank, whether either of us was ready or not. By the time the session ended, the rain had stopped. I stepped outside into a world washed clean and glistening. Elira did not follow me this time. I walked the long way back to my quarters, the echo of her voice repeating in my head, like the tide itself, Kieran. That single word had opened a door I had spent 8 winters trying to seal shut. Now the wind blew through it cold and insistent, carrying the scent of salt and possibility, and the quiet terror that this time I might not survive losing her again. Greyhaven plunged into the most heated season of negotiations in a decade. The new harbor was never merely about timber and stone. It represented power staggering fortunes, disputed territory, and the fragile peace still holding between humans and orcs after generations of border wars. That single undertaking made it impossible for me to keep my distance from her. We crossed paths in council chambers, thick with pipe smoke on rain-slicked quays, where waves slammed against pilings at stiff formal dinners, hosted by the Port Authority, along the shadowed corridors of the Voss estate, during wind-lashed inspections of submerged rock ledges, and even inside the old chapel where nobles gathered to speak in elegant circles about matters that changed nothing. Each encounter found her wrapped in flawless composure, polite nods, measured words, perfect posture. And every flawless performance left me more restless than the last. I had once believed the cruelest pain would strike if I saw her living contentedly without me. I had been wrong. The true torment came from watching her move through her days carrying no contentment at all. She performed her duties with quiet grace and unassailable manners, yet beneath the surface lay a sorrow so carefully concealed that only someone who had once memorized every shade of her heart could detect it. One grey morning, the council commanded me and the Voss representative to survey the disputed eastern berths over orc wool ship mooring rights. The representative was naturally Elira. We rode together in a close carriage, the space between us no wider than an arm's length, yet the silence stretched wider than the northern ice fields. Rain traced silver threads down the window glass, wheels crunched over wet cobblestones. I sat facing her, hands resting on my knees, pretending to watch the passing streets, while every subtle shift of her body pulled at my attention like an invisible tide. She spoke first, voice low and careful. "Does your shoulder still trouble you when the cold settles in?" I turned my head slowly. I assumed you had forgotten the location of my old injuries. She hesitated, then answered softly. "I have forgotten nothing." Her words charged the confined air with sudden peril. I looked away toward the blurred city outside. The ache remains, but I have learned to live with it. I noticed how her fingers tightened on the fabric of her gown. I hated that I noticed. When we reached the eastern berths, the wind howled with savage force, snapping mooring lines taut and driving waves hard against the wooden pilings. While a young merchant pointed out details on a soaked blueprint, a slick plank shifted beneath Alira's boot. She lost balance. I moved without thought. My hand seized her arm and pulled her firmly against my chest. For one shattering heartbeat, her body pressed into mine. I caught the faint trace of dried herbs she still kept tucked inside her clothing, the same subtle scent that once clung to my uniform long after she had gone. Elira lifted her gaze. In that instant, the 8 missing seasons dissolved into nothing. I released her almost immediately. "Careful," I muttered. "Thank you," she whispered, the words nearly lost beneath the roar of the sea. I turned away before the urge to brush rain from her cheek overpowered every ounce of restraint I possessed. That evening I attended dinner at the residence of Lady Isolde Wren, a sharp-witted human widow whose wealth and influence had expanded steadily since the war. We could speak plainly with each other, a rare comfort in Greyhaven. Rumors had already begun linking our names. I knew those rumors would reach Elira, and I knew exactly whose heart they would strike hardest. Over wine, Isolde studied me with clear, knowing eyes. "So tell me, Kieran, how much of your mind does Elira Voss still claim?" I frowned. "Must you always cut straight to the bone?" "Yes." "And you must stop pretending the wound has healed." I stared into my glass. She never truly left. Isolde set her wine down, her expression turning serious. "Then are you angry with her? Or with the younger version of yourself who allowed that day to hollow you out for 8 long winters?" I offered no answer, because both were true. Across the city that same night, Elira watched my carriage halt outside Lady Isolde Wren's brightly lit home, and for the first time in many weeks she permitted herself to believe the worst, that I had finally found someone else. Someone who would never be as weak as she had been 8 winters ago. Someone worthy of the man I had become. The following day she avoided my eyes throughout the entire council meeting. I recognized the shift at once. What I did not yet know was that the misunderstanding born that night would pull us both dangerously close to the edge of losing each other all over again. The rumors about my evenings at Lady Isolde Wren's residence spread through Greyhaven faster than any winter gale. I dismissed them without effort. After 8 winters on the frontier, empty words held no power over me. Elira could not brush them aside so easily. She began to appear less often at the public sessions. When our duties forced us into the same room, her voice remained perfectly level, her posture straight, her gaze steady. That flawless control only deepened my frustration. I had once believed the sharpest pain would strike if I saw her content without me. I had been wrong. The true torment came from watching her carry no contentment at all, only a quiet resignation. No one else seemed to notice. One afternoon, the Voss family hosted a tea gathering for several harbor partners. I had no wish to attend, but the council required my presence. I stepped into the familiar drawing room with its grey-green walls and tall windows facing the sea. The harp still stood in the corner exactly as it had 8 winters earlier, only I was no longer the awkward young soldier surrounded by silver and candlelight. Lady Talia greeted me with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Captain Ashvale, how pleasant to see you. The years have treated you well. I cannot say the same for every soul in Greyhaven," I answered coolly. She faltered for the briefest moment. Elira entered soon after, dressed in a black gown edged with silver, faint shadows beneath her eyes betraying sleepless nights. I stayed long enough to be polite. The older men discussed taxes and shipping fees. The women spoke of caravan routes and market prices. Elira's cousin Garrick sat near the window, laughing too loudly and talking too much, the clear sign of a man whose fortunes were slipping but who refused to admit it. When the conversation grew stifling, I excused myself to the hallway for air. The sea wind slipped through the tall glass panes, cold as iron. I had stood there barely a minute when the soft rustle of fabric reached me. "Elira." She stopped a few paces away. "Why do you avoid me?" I asked directly. She offered a faint smile that held no warmth. "I am not avoiding you. You are doing it right now." She turned her gaze toward the sea. "Are you going to marry Lady Isolde Wren?" I pivoted fully toward her. So that was the root of it. If the answer is yes, what then? She remained silent. 1 second. 2. On the third, I saw her fighting to keep her face from breaking apart. "Then I would wish you joy," she said. The perfect reply, the courteous reply, the one that made me want to shatter every pane of glass behind her. 8 winters ago, you were very skilled at saying exactly the right things, I replied. Are you still not tired of it? Elira turned to face me, her eyes no longer calm. Do you truly believe those 8 winters were easy for me? No. I stepped closer. I believe you lived with the safety of a decision others made for you, while I lived with the cost of it. Her face lost all color. You do not know you do not know what it feels like to stand on that dock and realize you were not worth the risk to the woman you loved. She drew a sharp breath as if my words had pierced straight through every layer of composure she wore. I never thought you were unworthy, she said, voice rough. I was only afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of poverty. Afraid of war. Afraid of watching you die far from home. Afraid I would become a burden to you. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes but refused to fall. And worst of all, I let others turn that fear into my own voice. I stood completely still. For the first time in 8 winters, I heard the truth. Not an excuse. The truth. What do you want me to say now? She asked quietly. That I was wrong, I have known it every single day for 8 winters. Those words made every trace of anger inside me waver. I should have softened. Instead, I spoke the cruelest thing I could find. Regret does not turn back time, Elira. She blinked hard, then she nodded once. I know. She walked past me down the hallway without looking back. I remained alone among the scent of salt and grey light, suddenly aware I had struck the softest part of her, and in doing so had struck the softest part of myself. That same night at Lady Isolde Wren's home, she took one look at my face and asked, What foolish thing have you done this time? I said nothing. Isolde set her wine glass down. Let me guess. You saw Elira. She finally spoke something honest. And you, after carrying that wounded pride for so long, decided to use your own pain as a weapon. I gave a cold laugh. You would make an excellent fortune teller. No. Her voice gentled. I am simply tired of watching two people who still love each other behave like two nations on the verge of war. I looked away into the fire. I no longer know what to do with what is left of that love. Then do not let it turn into cruelty, she said softly. But even as she spoke, I did not yet know that across the city, Elira had just discovered something far worse. Her cousin Garrick had secretly used her name in a draft marriage agreement sent to the wealthiest orc merchant on the western docks. Once again, her family was preparing to choose for her. Greyhaven plunged into its most heated season of negotiations in a decade. The new harbor was never merely about timber and stone. It represented power, staggering fortunes, disputed territory, and the fragile peace still holding between humans and orcs after generations of border wars. That single undertaking made it impossible for me to keep my distance from her. We crossed paths in council chambers, thick with pipe smoke on rain-slicked quays where waves slammed against pilings, at stiff formal dinners hosted by the Port Authority along the shadowed corridors of the Voss estate, during wind-lashed inspections of submerged rock ledges, and even inside the old chapel where nobles gathered to speak in elegant circles about matters that changed nothing. Each encounter found her wrapped in flawless composure, polite nods, measured words, perfect posture, and every flawless performance left me more restless than the last. I had once believed the cruelest pain would strike if I saw her living contentedly without me. I had been wrong. The true torment came from watching her move through her days carrying no contentment at all. She performed her duties with quiet grace and unassailable manners, yet beneath the surface lay a sorrow so carefully concealed that only someone who had once memorized every shade of her heart could detect it. One grey morning, the council commanded me and the Voss representative to survey the disputed eastern berths over orc wool ship mooring rights. The representative was naturally Elira. We rode together in a close carriage, the space between us no wider than an arm's length, yet the silence stretched wider than the northern ice fields. Rain traced silver threads down the window glass. Wheels crunched over wet cobblestones. I sat facing her, hands resting on my knees, pretending to watch the passing streets while every subtle shift of her body pulled at my attention like an invisible tide. She spoke, first voice low and careful. "Does your shoulder still trouble you when the cold settles in?" I turned my head slowly. "I assumed you had forgotten the location of my old injuries." She hesitated, then answered softly, "I have forgotten nothing." Her words charged the confined air with sudden peril. I looked away toward the blurred city outside. The ache remains, but I have learned to live with it. I noticed how her fingers tightened on the fabric of her gown. I hated that I noticed. When we reached the eastern berths, the wind howled with savage force, snapping mooring lines taut and driving waves hard against the wooden pilings. While a young merchant pointed out details on a soaked blueprint, a slick plank shifted beneath Elira's boot. She lost balance. I moved without thought. My hand seized her arm and pulled her firmly against my chest. For one shattering heartbeat, her body pressed into mine. I caught the faint trace of dried herbs she still kept tucked inside her clothing, the same subtle scent that once clung to my uniform long after she had gone. Elira lifted her gaze. In that instant, the 8 missing seasons dissolved into nothing. I released her almost immediately. "Careful," I muttered. "Thank you," she whispered, the words nearly lost beneath the roar of the sea. I turned away before the urge to brush rain from her cheek overpowered every ounce of restraint I possessed. That evening I attended dinner at the residence of Lady Isolde Wren, a sharp-witted human widow whose wealth and influence had expanded steadily since the war. We could speak plainly with each other, a rare comfort in Greyhaven. Rumors had already begun linking our names. I knew those rumors would reach Elira, and I knew exactly whose heart they would strike hardest. Over wine, Isolde studied me with clear, knowing eyes. "So tell me, Kieran, how much of your mind does Elira Voss still claim?" I frowned. "Must you always cut straight to the bone?" "Yes, and you must stop pretending the wound has healed." I stared into my glass. "She never truly left." Isolde set her wine down, her expression turning serious. "Then are you angry with her? Or with the younger version of yourself who allowed that day to hollow you out for 8 long winters?" I offered no answer, because both were true. Across the city that same night, Elira watched my carriage halt outside Lady Isolde Wren's brightly lit home, and for the first time in many weeks she permitted herself to believe the worst, that I had finally found someone else. Someone who would never be as weak as she had been 8 winters ago. Someone worthy of the man I had become. The following day she avoided my eyes throughout the entire council meeting. I recognized the shift at once. What I did not yet know was that the misunderstanding born that night would pull us both dangerously close to the edge of losing each other all over again. I received sailing orders within 5 days. The escort mission would take me north beyond the ice again, but I knew that once the anchor lifted, whatever remained between Elira and me would freeze solid once more. 3 days before departure, I was summoned to a private meeting at the Voss estate concerning final harbor land agreements. The moment I stepped into the great hall, I felt the tension crackling like a rope about to snap. Elira stood at the center of the room, one hand resting on a draft marriage contract that had been torn cleanly in two. Her cousin Garrick stood at the head of the table, face flushed with anger. Lady Talia sat rigid as stone. 2 wealthy orc merchants watched in silence. I had never seen her like this. Not the gentle, composed woman who had greeted me with perfect courtesy in every council chamber. This was someone who had finally grown tired of being a shadow. I have explained this is only to keep the boss name from ruin, Garrick snapped. Elira looked straight at him. By selling my name, do not use that word. Then what word would you use for signing a marriage agreement in my name without asking me a single question? Lady Talia tried to intervene, her voice cold. Elira, you must understand this is necessary. Women in this family have never been allowed to live by their hearts alone. I watched Elira's hand tremble, but her voice stayed steady and clear. Then perhaps that is why this family has never known real happiness. The room fell silent. Garrick glanced at me as if my presence had suddenly become an embarrassment. Elira no longer cared who heard. She turned to face the entire room, amber eyes bright with a fire I had waited 8 winters to see. 8 winters ago, I let others teach me that love must be measured by money, honor, and the safety of the family. I let them fear for me, think for me, decide for me. And I lived with the consequences of that choice every single day. Lady Talia's face drained of color. Elira's voice cut through like a blade. This time it will not happen again. She looked at every face around the table. No one is permitted to use my name, my life, or my heart to patch the holes you yourselves created. I will not marry anyone to save your reputations, and I will not allow anyone to choose for me ever again. The silence that followed felt heavier than any winter storm. I stood in the doorway unseen, witnessing the moment I had waited 8 winters for without daring to admit it. The meeting ended in stunned quiet. I slipped away before Elira could notice me, because if I stayed 1 second longer, I would not have been able to hold myself back. That same night, I went to Lady Isolde Wren to say farewell before sailing. She was sorting papers when she spoke without looking up. Elira came to see me earlier. I stopped mid-step. What did she want? She asked me a very painful question. Isolde finally met my eyes. She asked if I loved you. I closed my eyes. What did you tell her? I told her no. Isolde leaned back in her chair. Then I added that the man I care for would never look at me the way you look at her, not even once. I let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but never quite reached it. You should thank me, she said. I am tired of playing the third person in a story that should have ended beautifully long ago. I left her house with my heart hammering like a new recruit's on his first campaign. When I reached the docks, the duty officer handed me a small folded note. No seal, no signature, only one line in Elira's handwriting. If you have not yet sailed, please wait for me at the Eastern Quay. I stared at those words until the sea wind made the paper tremble in my fingers. Then I went. Because after everything, if she had finally taken the first step, I had no reason left to stand still. The Eastern Quay lay almost empty past midnight. Gas lamps flickered in the wind. Black water glittered silver where it slapped against the wooden pilings. Mooring ropes creaked like tired breaths. I stood beneath the last lamp cloak whipping around me, chest burning despite the cold. Then I heard footsteps. Elira emerged from the sea mist, black gown clinging to her tall frame from the damp wind, strands of black hair escaping the silver clasp. Her cheeks were flushed from running. Her breathing came quick, but her eyes held nothing but raw honesty. Kieran. I took 1 step toward her. You should not be out here alone at this hour. I have spent 8 winters doing only what I should. Tonight I am done listening to that voice. Even then she could still make me want to smile through the ache. Speak, I said quietly. Elira stopped in front of me, bare hands clenched so tightly the knuckles showed white. I was weak, she said. No circling, no pretty words. 8 winters ago I loved you, but I was not strong enough to keep you against my family. I let them teach me fear. I let them decide what was wise, what was suitable, what was safe. And I thought I was doing the right thing. The wind whipped between us. She blinked hard, but no tears fell. I know how much pain I caused you. I do not need you to tell me. Because not a single day passed in those 8 winters that I did not wonder what our lives would have been if I had only been braver for one moment. I did not interrupt. Elira lifted her gaze and looked straight into my eyes. Today, when they tried to use my name again to buy their own security, I finally felt sick of the girl I used to be. I could not bear the thought of staying silent one more time. She drew a deep breath. I do not know if you still love me. I have no right to ask after what I did. Her voice trembled for the first time. But if you sail tomorrow without hearing this truth, I will regret it until the day I die. I closed the last small distance between us. What truth? Elira looked at me, and in her eyes there was nothing left but herself. No family, no harbor, no other voices. That I still love you. She spoke the words as if finally pulling a knife from her own chest. I never stopped loving you. The cold wind passed between us like a wave. I closed my eyes for one heartbeat. 8 winters. 8 seasons of ice. 8 years of keeping one small part of my heart locked away so no one would see it. Then I opened my eyes. And if this time I still have nothing to offer but myself, I asked softly. Elira smiled through the tears that finally gathered at the corners of her eyes. Then this time she said, I will choose you. I do not know who reached first. I only know that one moment later, my hand was at the back of her neck, and her lips met mine in the middle of salt air, cold wind, and flickering lamplight. The kiss was not fierce like the grand tales people weave about great love. It was the kiss of two people who had waited too long, hurt too long, and grown too much to waste even 1 second of it. When we finally drew apart, her forehead rested against my chin. I heard her whisper, voice breaking, "This time I will not let anyone choose for me." I pulled her closer, holding her, as if I could keep the whole world from taking her away again. "Then do not let go," I said. Elira nodded against my chest. I had been scheduled to sail at dawn. I delayed the departure 3 days. 3 days were enough for Elira to publicly withdraw from every marriage arrangement her family had made. 3 days were enough for me to stand before Garrick and make it very clear that no one would ever use her name again without answering to me. 3 days were enough for Lady Isolde to quietly arrange a seat for Elira on the New Harbour Civilian Coordination Committee. And 3 days were enough for Lady Talia to face for the first time in her life a woman in her family who refused to be obedient any longer. No miracle changed everyone overnight, but the truth had finally been spoken. Elira had stopped living as the 19-year-old girl she once was, and I had finally stopped using an old wound as the only thing keeping me standing. Winter closed slowly that year. The New Harbour sent its first convoy out at the end of the second snow month. That morning, a thin layer of ice covered the railings along the quay. Ship bells rang low and long. Humans and orcs stood shoulder to shoulder on the docks, no longer fully trusting each other, but beginning to understand that the future could not be built on hatred forever. I stood at the edge of the pier in my uniform. Elira was beside me, wrapped in a grey-green cloak, papers from the coordination committee in her hand. The sea wind lifted strands of her hair across her cheek. "Did you ever think we would stand here like this?" she asked. "Yes," I answered. She turned to me, surprised. "Truly, many times more than I should admit." I looked out across the water. "The only difference is that in those dreams you caused me far less trouble." Elira laughed. The sound blended with the creak of wood, the wind, and the waves until Greyhaven itself felt a little less cold. She reached out and touched my hand openly without hiding. "I am sorry," she said, but this time the words carried no heavy weight. "For making you wait so long." I closed my fingers around hers. "You came back." I looked at her. "That is enough." It was not enough to erase everything we had lost, but it was enough for everything still ahead. And for two people who had let too many winters steal from them, being allowed to choose each other again was the closest thing to a miracle either of us would ever need.